Hello and welcome. In this episode, we will be taking a look at the holy and unholy history of Bedlam and how it evolved from slang to a medical term. The word Bedlam has an interesting etymology because technically it started out not as its own word, but a corruption of the name Bethlehem before it took on an entirely new meaning of its own. And while its history dates all the way back to the 15th century, its etymology actually has absolutely nothing to do with what the word has come to mean. So here is the history of how Bedlam became a part of the English lexicon. In 1247, there was a priory founded in London on a plot of land donated by a wealthy politician of the time named Simon Fitzmary, who is said to have developed a deep veneration for the Virgin Mary and Star of Bethlehem during his time fighting in the Crusades. Initially, this institution was intended to collect donations as a means of obtaining financial aid for the Crusaders and to establish a connection between England and the Holy Land. The priory at first functioned as a place to house the poor, as well as provide hospitality to church affiliates such as bishops, canons, and brothers. The institution was devoted to caring for the city's poor, and its title officially changed from priory to hospital about a century later. However, it was not a hospital as we would think of one today, but rather a medieval interpretation of the term, which was used to mean an institution intended to help care for the needy, usually funded by taxes or donations. Originally intended to serve the Church of Bethlehem, although in the 14th century its ties to the church were becoming looser, eventually leading to the Bethlehemite bishops relocating to France and necessitating city authorities in London to step in and help with the responsibility of running the facility. This, in addition to politics of the time, saw the institution becoming increasingly secularized until the dawning of the 15th century, when the last vestiges of the Bethlehemites were phased out. It was around the same time, in the early 1400s, when the hospital was officially converted into a lunatic asylum. The Hospital of St. Mary's of Bethlehem, later known as Bedlam Royal Hospital, was England's first hospital for the mentally ill, and likely the most infamous as well. During the course of the hospital's first 200 years, it became known colloquially as Bedlam, a variant of Bethlehem, which itself is a variant of Bethlehem, a shortened version of the hospital's full name. It was during the Jacobean era that the term Bedlam took on its own meaning apart from the hospital, and it was used to describe madness and chaos. It would seem obvious that this meaning is due to the residents of the institution, but it is very likely that the hospital's administration had a large role in crafting the image of Bedlam. The keepers of Bedlam Royal Hospital were typically appointed through nepotism, usually to reward loyal friends or servants, and they viewed their position as a sinecure, meaning that it was thought to yield profit for little to no effort. This philosophy meant that the patients were living in squalor, an abundance of human waste, the building dilapidated, the roof caving in, lack of clothing and food. Many of the residents looked starved, and the conditions were so shameful that the government stepped in to make repairs and provide basic necessities. It was after this, in the mid-1630s, when Bedlam began to move closer to our modern-day concept of a hospital, being staffed by an apothecary as well as a physician and a surgeon, although the roles were non-residential. And in order to limit corruption, the role of the physician became salaried. Therefore, they would not be paid on a patient-to-patient basis, and the doctor could not skim funds from the hospital for their own benefit. It took quite a few decades, but eventually the roles of surgeon and apothecary were also put on salary. In the late 17th century through to the 19th century, hydrotherapy was employed for those patients deemed well enough to participate. However, They were also subjected to much more arduous treatments, such as bloodletting, as well as being administered emetics and purgatives in order to induce vomiting or voiding of the bowels, respectively. In fact, these tactics were used rigorously enough that patients would be discharged or even refused entry if they were deemed unfit to survive the physical toll of the treatment. In the late 1600s, it became clear that the current building which housed the patients was no longer viable. Not only was it in ruin, but it was not large enough to meet the demand of the city's inhabitants, so it was relocated to the Moorfields of northern London. Interestingly, the architect of the new hospital was noted polymath and scientist Robert Hooke, better known for his discovery of microorganisms, which he first observed under the lens of a compound microscope, which he had built himself. In addition to his study of natural philosophy and science, he was also an architect who had conducted archaeological surveys of London in the aftermath of the Great Fire of 1666, making him well suited to the job of creating a new building to house the patients of Bedlam. The new building was large and dignified, completely enclosed by walls with 6 gates at the front, and carvings meant to display afflictions such as mania and melancholy, to explicitly portray the hospital's purpose to all those who saw it. It featured 6 gates in the 8-foot walls along the front, the lowest of any of the building's surrounding walls. This was intentional, as the hospital wanted to portray to people that they were a well-run and charitable organization, in hopes that this would inspire donations, which were necessary for the institution's survival. And it seemed as though the hospital really did want to provide its patients with a healthy and clean environment, which included larger rooms, well-lit galleries, and outdoor spaces where the residents could get fresh air. During this time, public viewings of the occupants was a common practice, justified by the fact that, although there was no admission fee, the showings did encourage donations from visitors. This was not abnormal for the time. Many similar institutions also allowed public viewings as a means of increasing revenue. However, this was often at the expense of the patients, who were subject to mistreatments such as being poked, taunted, assaulted, and harassed. Despite the opulent and palatial compound that housed Bedlam's occupants, a building which was often likened to France's Versailles Palace, the building began falling apart almost immediately due to the grounds that it had been built on. The Moorfields, more than anything else, were a swamp, with uneven, wet grounds that didn't have the stability to support the weight of such a grand building. The outer back wall had cracked. The floor was built almost directly over the ground with no notable foundation laid. The roof soon began leaking, and the walls within the building were noted to have been neither sound, upright, nor level by a surveyor of the property. By the early 19th century, plans had been set in place to move the hospital yet again to St. George's Fields, a similarly boggy area, though it seems that better care was taken in the construction of the building. During this time, there were great reforms in how people thought to care for patients of these asylums, and the philosophy was beginning to progress towards rehabilitation instead of imprisonment and harsh treatments. But even with government backing, it took a number of years to set these reforms into place. So now that we know the history, let's talk about where the word Bedlam comes from. Bedlam is a colloquial name for the Bedlam Royal Hospital, with Bedlam itself being a bastardization of Bethlehem from the facility's original moniker, the Hospital of St. Mary's of Bethlehem, which we touched on earlier. The name Bethlehem traces its roots back millennia, with popular variations popping up in Latin, Bethlehemum, and Greek, Bethlehem. But ultimately, its origins lie in Hebrew as Bethlehem. The first part of this word that we can explore is bet, which is Hebrew for house or house of. This is descended from the word beta, which comes from the proto-Semitic beit, also meaning house or home, And there are many derivatives of this word throughout Semitic languages, including the Arabic language, Aramaic, Hebrew, and more. There are even some connections between Semitic languages and ancient Egyptian, including this very word, which takes the form of beit, meaning hole or pit. Although the ancient Egyptian word for house is actually Romanized as PR, thought to be pronounced par, which the word pharaoh is derived from, but we can dive into that in a different episode. Par actually lent its hieroglyph to be used as the pictograph, the symbol for the letter, for the Canaanite word for house, beit, which the Latin letter B is a descendant of, and par, as well as its other pictographic descendants, all feature an enclosed or semi-enclosed space as a representation of a house, or specifically a tent, which would have been more accurate at the time of its inception. The Greek letter beta is also derived from this same root, borrowing from the Phoenician alphabet, whose correlating letter is called Beth. The Phoenician alphabet is an immediate descendant of the Canaanite alphabet, which was directly derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs, like the example previously mentioned. The second half of the word Bethlehem is taken from the Hebrew word lechem, meaning bread. It has also been used in reference to grain with which to make bread, or food in general, but its literal translation is simply bread. So the meaning of Bethlehem would be house of bread. However, there is also a separate Arabic interpretation, Bedlam, meaning house of meat. The idea is that the city of Bethlehem itself is plentiful, and there is an abundance of food and resources. The original city of Bethlehem, which lends its name to so many other towns and institutions, was likely given the name due to how fertile the land was and the way it could support both crops and animals to feed its inhabitants. But as I mentioned, the etymology of Bedlam has nothing to do with what the word has come to mean. There is an interesting juxtaposition between the root word of Bethlehem and the offshoot that sprung from it. The house of bread became the house of madness. And the fact that this shift isn't represented in the individual morphemes that make up the word is what makes Bedlam such an interesting word to study, especially considering that it is such an established part of the English lexicon. Bedlam has multiple meanings depending on the context. It can be used to describe a place, specifically an asylum for the mentally ill, a close reference to its origin, and along with this, it has a use in psychology, which defines it as a state of frenzy or confusion. However, the most common usage is to describe a scene of great chaos and confusion. And this word has taken root to the point that it even has its own derivations, such as Bedlamite, a word meaning an insane person. What happened at St. Mary's to spark Bedlam's complete departure from the origin of Bethlehem is the same thing that always tends to happen at these facilities. Too many patients and inadequate resources, space, and care, not to mention greed from the powers that be. The Hospital of St. Mary's of Bethlehem broke from its early, well-intentioned mission of caring for London's sick and poor to become the infamous origins of Bedlam. And although there is no longer a Hospital of St. Mary's of Bethlehem or a Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the founding institution has not completely disappeared. After being relocated several times over the centuries as discussed, it was finally absorbed into a different hospital and is now a part of the National Health Service. Thank you so much for listening all the way through if you did. Please leave a like if you would like to hear more episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment if there are any other words you would like to see covered in the future.